welcome to another episode of Short Story Boudoir. I'm Katy Gathright.
And I'm Samantha Neugebauer.
And today we're talking about the story The Demon Lover by Elizabeth Bowen. We thought we would choose a spooky-ish story for spooky season. Very happy about the transition into fall and have some fall treats to enjoy afterwards too.
Yes. And so if you're not familiar with Elizabeth Bowen's work, The Demon Lover is apparently one of her most anthologized stories. I don't think either of us read it growing up, though.
No, I hadn't.
But she is an Anglo-Irish writer. I think she is often taught in British curriculum, at least that's what I'm told. And this particular story was written in the early 1940s following the Blitz. And the story itself is also set, I think, immediately after or during the Blitz. It concerns a character named Catherine. It's a very short story. It's less than 5 pages in my edition. And she is returned to London to the family house there to collect some belongings. And I should say now that we're going to be giving spoilers. So
yes,
if you haven't
definitely
read this, go into our comment section and read the story. It will not take you long.
No, it's worth doing. It really won't take long.
Absolutely. Because there's no way to talk about the story without spoiling it. Because it is so short and it is so eerie. And so, you have this London that has been transformed from the war. There are no other human eyes on her block when she gets there. And she thinks it's going to be kind of a simple exchange in the house where she's going to go in and kind of grab some things and go back to the country house. But when she arrives, she feels a lot of unfamiliarity, a lot of feelings, and she finds a letter in the house, which is or isn't from an ex-fiance who was lost during World War I. And so the tail end of the story is her kind of dealing with her fear of what this letter means. In the letter, it said that they were going to meet that day, and the kind of the questions that this letter, asks of her. And as readers, we're not really sure what to make of this. So that's the story in like a very short summary. And I'm excited to talk about it more with all of you and with Katy.
Yeah. I've been really excited to talk about this one. And I was just thinking as you were talking how maybe it seems like the shortest stories are the ones that you are like the most spoilable. Like you can't get into them at all without talking about how they end. And so I thought maybe we would talk about the end first, actually.
Perfect. Okay.
So the ending of this story kind of operates as a cliffhanger because, as Samantha was saying, she has this letter from the ex-fiance and there's this hint that they're going to meet up that day. And she does, at the end of the story, get into this taxi cab on her curb, and the driver sort of kidnaps her.
Right.
That word isn't used, but they sort of speed off without Kathleen saying where to go. And there's sort of this ambiguous feeling about, is the taxi driver the demon lover / ex-fiance?
Right.
Is this more of a coincidence? So I'm just curious how you read the ending and kind of how you felt at the end of the story.
Well, what's interesting to me about scary stories is, like, do you go into them as someone who believes in the supernatural or not? Or if that's not the right question, do you go into, say, believing that some kind of form of supernatural activity might exist, but it might not necessarily be ghosts or kind of ghosts of people we met in our life at some point. So I kind of would like go into the story thinking that, the world is mysterious and that there maybe are forces that we cannot understand. And that some of those forces maybe just have to do with kind of our psyche interacting with our environment.
Yeah.
So in short, I guess I read the ending the way I read everything in the story from the letter on, because everything about how you read this is really related to that question you ask yourself about what you believe.
No, that's actually really helpful because I was thinking about it like, oh, it's the story's job or any story's job, whether it's this story, another story, a movie, to basically persuade or convince you about supernatural elements. But I think you're right that maybe the question is not, can the story persuade you? The question is, what is your orientation coming into the story? And does that story like enrich whatever version of life you believe in, like the supernatural
Right.
version or the version where maybe there's just mysterious things abound, you know?
Right. Well, what about you? Like, or do you feel like this story has the possibility to persuade you, kind of?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that the story obviously changes when the letter appears, and from that moment on, it's a different kind of story. And I don't read this as a strict ghost story.
Right.
I don't think I read like demon literally in this story,
Right.
but I do believe in haunting, and I guess I am convinced that there is a real haunting taking place. And I think that this woman is haunted by her past, and I think she is haunted by the present, which is very subtle in the story,
Right.
the sort of like oblique references to the war. But
Right.
I do feel like that's a big force as well. And so I guess maybe I'm just like splitting hairs with semantics and different words, but I think it's a haunting story, maybe not a supernatural story.
Right, and I don't think you're splitting hairs at all, because I do think that when we say that we're going to talk about a scary story, scary that might have a ghost, a World War I veteran in it, alive or dead, there's a crustiness to it, right? Like that, kind of stinks of some like Edith Wharton, Henry James, love them both, but that, this might have been entertaining for people in the past, but like kind of like irrational and light people today will just have to take this as like kitsch. And like, I mean, that's so condescending.
I know. I do think that way though sometimes. Where I'm like, well, they didn't have very good entertainment.
Right, exactly.
So,
they believed anything.
Yeah.
Right. So, but I actually think that in some ways, like I approach a ghost story the same way I approach like a supernatural movie nowadays too.
Yeah. And I took this story very seriously.
Me too.
Honestly.
Absolutely.
I mean, I do think it's so funny because as we describe it maybe, and again, hopefully you've read it already, but like it does sound kind of kitschy maybe or like wild, but I feel like the story makes me take this character so seriously.
Absolutely.
And I was so there with her for this haunting.
Absolutely. And so let's maybe transition then to like what we get to understand about this soldier.
Yeah.
Because like we said, it's a very short story, and Bowen does this remarkable thing where we're in the present with our protagonist. She's read the letter, right? And then almost without any transition, right, we get this line. The young girl talking to the soldier in the garden had not ever completely seen his face. It was dark. They were saying goodbye under a tree. I mean, that's such a strange way to start a flashback, right? And what is interesting about it is we get a couple other lines of dialogue between the soldier and the girl before he goes back off to the war, because he was on leave from France. We know that. But we get nothing about their courtship. I think it lasted a week.
Yeah.
And so my question, for you is, why do you think we get kind of this strange departure meeting where she is also frightened? We learn that young Kathleen is frightened. She wants him to go. She doesn't remember his face. Like, we don't get any of like the joyful moments.
Yeah.
Were there any?
Yeah. No, it's a great question because you're absolutely right. We really only see this sort of dark sliver of the ending of their relationship. And as I was reading and as I was thinking about my opinion on this, I try not to always think about things from the writer's point of view, but I do think here the story feels like it would have been a much cheaper story if it was like a classic tale of like love gone wrong and, we have to feel really sad that they never got married and lived this life together, because that feels kitschy to me. Like that feels stale. And so it feels very, artistic, I guess, to not go that route. But I think in terms of the emotional impact of that choice, I also think it is part of what makes me take this story seriously, because I do think we are not just haunted by great things that never were. Like, I think we can be haunted by very mundane things. And in some ways, I feel like the fact that we don't know much about the soldier, the fact that he is sort of like barely characterized, and what we get is that he, I think, she even uses the word unkindly,
Right.
something about him, right? Makes me feel like the emphasis is really on this young woman and her youth more than the relationship. I feel like what's lost is more that feeling of being, 16, beginning of life, rather than the man himself being lost.
Yeah, and it's such a kind of testament to Bowen's power of withholding in a way that is kind of exhilarating for the reader, like not to know anything more about, this demon lover, this kind of ghost from the past. And, it also feels a bit of like Keats' negative capability or capacity, right? That we're really missing a lot of the pieces here.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself is spooky, right? Like, I was thinking about this, like, instead of putting my kind of self in Kathleen's feet, like if my best friend, right, or maybe you were telling me this story from the past, I would be freaked out. I would be like, well, who was he? Like, you don't remember his face? Like that, it's actually scary for me to hear it about someone I would care about more than myself in a way, because I would be doubtful of my memories. I would be like, what does that even mean?
Yeah, that's such a great point, actually. You're right, that is actually the scariest part of the story. It makes me think of this book you may have read, The Witch Elm by Tana French, in which the protagonist is really like, it's a spooky book, it's a spooky novel. What's spooky about it is the protagonist not being able to remember things that happened in his past. And I do think memory is spooky, and I think the way she has this sort of like black mark over her teenage years is sort of chilling in its own way.
I think that maybe in a way the story is asking you to focus on the soldier and like the spookiness of him, that he might be like a cruel man or something, but maybe the spookiness is like also just like what your mind does with cruelty, right? And that must in some way like be related to whatever is happening then too in the war.
And feels so internal too. I think that's the other spooky element about memory in general, right? It's all contained within yourself, but also I don't get the feeling that she's talked about this with a lot of people. Like it seems like her family sort of comforted her after this happened, and then she was meant to move on, and I do feel like there's that sense that she's very alone with these feelings in this aftermath.
And do you feel like Bowen meant for us to feel like she had sort of forgotten this soldier and just remembered him because of the letter, or do you feel like it's always kind of there, like a little static?
That's a good question. I think I feel honestly split. Like I really like both readings. I like the idea of her having forgotten and then coming across this letter and sort of immediately being pulled into the past, and there's no like moment where she's wondering who could this be about. Like it's instant,
right?
But I could believe that it could be instant and still not have been something she's thought about for a while. But I also like the idea that maybe her whole life she feels like has been different since that last day that she saw her ex-fiance. And there's like a before times in her life and an after times in her life. And maybe it's not even about him, but it's just about like, that's when she grew up.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me.
So did you like this character?
I did like this character because I felt like she had internal consistency. Right? I think that she herself never felt like she descended like into madness. It was almost like that was external. And I really like that. I think it's much easier to write a character who like starts doing goofy things, right, rather than a character who like through outside forces is changed internally, you know? So I was impressed like with her as a character. We don't really know much about her, and in a way she's almost always overwhelmed by atmosphere. Like when I started reading this, we get a great kind of description of the London street she walks down. We get, these interesting descriptions of the house that has been closed up because of the war. There's like a bruise spot on the ceiling, and there's like a claw mark on the floor where the piano's been. And for me, she was always kind of faded into the background of the atmosphere. And I wonder if like that is what your life can sort of be if you have these dramatic events happening right immediately around you. That's much different than like, you know, something terrible that is happening far away.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know.
No, I think that's right. I mean, the mood setting feels so intentional at the
Mhm.
beginning of this story. And I think it's sort of what allows Bowen to make the war feel very important to the story
Right.
without, you know, unnecessary exposition about like
Right.
the fact that there's a war going
Right.
on.
I think
you
it's
know?
like 2 lines,
Yeah.
right? That's all we get.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that sense that it's in the background, but
Mhm.
also not at all.
Right.
And that this is almost a break for Kathleen to be, she has such freedom, like she's almost like outside of time in this house, even though it's very grounded in a specific period of time.
Right, and I've heard the writer Tessa Hadley talk about Elizabeth Bowen and how she's just so good at light and like conveying kind of the physicality of settings and things, and I certainly felt that here, right? Like this is not one of those spooky stories where you feel like you're sort of levitating, right?
Yeah.
And I think those stories have their charms for sure, but I would put like Carmen Maria Machado's work there. Like there's something that's not very grounded in the story, but here I felt very much like in a time, like in a time and in a place that was grounded with real objects. Right.
Yeah.
I felt her walking through the rooms.
Yeah. It's very tactile in a way.
That's much better word choice than the 20 words I just said to describe the word tactile.
The writing is good. So should we talk about the favorite lines that we
Absolutely.
had?
I love that idea.
You can go first.
Okay. So my line is a bit long this time, and it comes from the later half in the story where, you know, she's starting to really feel like maybe this ex-soldier, maybe his ghost, she doesn't know, alive or dead, is actually in the house with her and trying to decide if she should leave. And so Bowen writes, the desuetude of her former bedroom, her married London home's whole air of being a cracked cup from which memory, with its reassuring power, had either evaporated or leaked away, made a crisis. And at just this crisis the letter writer had, knowledgeably struck. The hollowness of the house this evening canceled years on years of voices, habits, and steps. And so I chose this, not because I think that, you know, it has a particularly interesting syntax or anything, but because of that one clause, the home's whole air of being a cracked cup from which memory. And I couldn't help thinking about one of my favorite autumn poems, which is I Walked Out One Evening. And that it's a poem about time and about love and, you know, about, you know, people disappointing you, but time going on and so many other wonderful things. And so I was like, that line reminds me so much of this line. And I looked at the poem. It was published in 1940. And right like maybe you know, around the same time. And so I thought I'd just read that one stanza where he says, the glacier knocks in the cupboard, the desert sighs in the bed, and the crack in the teacup opens a lane to the land of the dead. And so, you know, that's exactly what's happening in this story. All these objects are sort of opening up these lanes of memories to the land of the dead, and like whether like that land is like in our head or not feels very much a part of what Bowen is doing here.
Yeah, I love that connection, and I do love the idea that I don't know, that this like poem is rattling around in her head as she's trying to bring this woman to life. It's such a good connection. Yeah. It's really good.
I know. I feel like she's not around to tell us if that's true or not, but you know, I think it's a good thing to have rattling.
I mean, I would love to be a dead writer and somebody is assuming that I'm making a poetic connection. So I think it's only complimentary. Yeah.
And what about you? Did you have a favorite line?
Yeah, well, I like the writing in the story a lot in general, but one line I have that I wanted to single out was this one. So, turning from her own face as precipitously as she had gone to meet it, she went to the chest where the things were, unlocked it, threw up the lid, and knelt to search. And it's a kind of a boring line, and so you're probably like, why did I choose that? But I like a couple things about it. One thing I really like about it is we were talking about how tactile this story is and how grounded we feel like we are in the house. And I think it's so cool that Bowen gives us so many interesting details, like the cracked cup, so many little things to latch onto, but is comfortable saying, she's just there to get some things.
Right.
Like the whole like plot of the story happens because she's like going to this house to pick up things to bring to her country house.
Right.
And it's just not important what the things are.
No.
They're just things, and I love it when a story can like pick and choose what to focus on. And I think that's just a helpful little trick. She doesn't need to go all in there.
You're so right, because I could see a different version where a lesser writer said, so we know that she has 3 boys, like that comes across. She's married with 3 sons, and I don't even think we get their ages.
Yeah,
but I could see it like, you know, she had to pick up like Tommy's lacrosse stick or cricket stick. I don't know.
Cricket bat.
Cricket bat. And, you know, and Henry's this and Philip's this.
Yeah.
And I would just feel like that would take you out, right?
That instantly would make it a story about being like this like mother who is like, you know, sort of like isolated in her motherhood and doing things for others. But it's like really not about that.
Absolutely not. Yeah. Those things don't matter, because those things like aren't alive like in the moment. And I don't even know, does she end up getting them or not?
I think she was going to bring the taxi back to the house to get the things. So I think the demon lover has derailed that plan, maybe, depending on how you read the ending. But you're right, because the things don't matter. Anyway.
Absolutely.
So it's interesting. The stakes of the story are set in motion because of the things. The things don't matter.
Yeah.
And
I think that's a good kind of craft technique to keep in our heads.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love this story.
Yeah, I liked it too. I hadn't read it before. I think I will probably seek out more Bowen stories now. But it's such a good, tight story that's like perfect to, you know, chat about with a friend or anybody else.
Or if you're like home alone one night and you just like make yourself some tea, some dessert. Just sit by yourself and read it.
Next on our agenda.
Exactly.
Well, thanks for joining for another episode. I hope you enjoyed this story as well, and we'll see you next month.
Bye.